Hollywood legend Steven Seagal walked onto the View set, his weathered beard framing a knowing smile. The hosts thought they'd trapped an aging action star. They had no idea what was coming. Steven Seagal, the legendary action star whose career had spanned decades of bone-crushing fight scenes and philosophical one-liners, stepped onto the View set with the unhurried confidence of a man who'd faced down countless adversaries. His salt and pepper beard, thick and well-groomed, framed a face that had weathered Hollywood storms for over 30 years. The studio buzzed with anticipation and barely concealed hostility. The hosts, Whoopi Goldberg, Joy Behar, and Sunny Hostin, sat poised like predators, their questions sharpened for what they believed would be an easy takedown of a has-been action hero. This was no ordinary interview. It was a carefully orchestrated ambush disguised as daytime television, designed to expose Seagal's controversial stances on Hollywood policies. But Seagal, adjusting his black leather jacket with practiced ease, didn't look like a man walking into a trap. He looked like someone who'd been through tougher fights than 3 talk show hosts could ever imagine. Whoopi leaned forward first, her voice carrying that familiar edge that had made her a daytime television powerhouse. "Steven," she began, deliberately omitting his surname to diminish his stature, "you've been very vocal about supporting policies like massive tariffs on foreign film production. Do you really believe that building these economic walls is the way to save Hollywood?" The question landed like a perfectly timed jab, designed to paint him as an isolationist relic. The cameras zoomed in, hungry for the fumbling response they expected from an aging action star out of his depth. But Seagal didn't flinch. Instead, he leaned back slightly, his movements fluid and controlled, like a martial artist assessing his opponent before striking. His voice, when it came, was that familiar gravelly whisper that had intimidated villains across dozens of films. "Whoopi," he said, his tone carrying the weight of decades in an industry that chewed up and spat out dreams, "in Aikido, we learn that true strength isn't about building walls. It's about redirecting force to protect what matters most. When I see American crews, the lighting technicians who've worked with me since my first film, the sound engineers who make our stories sing, when I see them losing work to cheaper overseas production, that's not about isolation. That's about honor." The words hung in the studio air like smoke from a gun barrel. Simple, direct, but carrying an unexpected philosophical depth that caught everyone off guard. The audience, which had been primed for a verbal massacre, fell silent for a heartbeat. Then, scattered applause began to ripple through the crowd, tentative at first, then growing bolder as viewers recognized something authentic in his response. Whoopi's eyebrows lifted slightly, a flicker of surprise crossing her practiced television face. She'd expected the usual Hollywood platitudes or defensive stammering. Instead, she'd gotten Eastern philosophy mixed with blue-collar solidarity, delivered with the quiet intensity that had made Seagal a star. The audience's reaction, though small, had shifted the energy in the room like a change in atmospheric pressure before a storm. The control room erupted in whispered conversations as producers realized their carefully planned narrative was already veering off script. On monitors showing real-time social media feeds, comments were beginning to flow, and they weren't the mockery the production team had anticipated. Instead, phrases like, "didn't expect that depth," and "Seagal making sense," began appearing with increasing frequency. Joy Behar, sensing the need to regain control, jumped in with the verbal equivalent of a sucker punch. Her voice carried decades of political combat, sharp and unforgiving. "But Steven, let's be real here," she said, her tone dripping with the kind of condescension usually reserved for particularly dim-witted politicians. "Tariffs like that drive up production costs. Movie tickets get more expensive, consumers suffer, and we risk sparking trade wars that could devastate the entire entertainment industry. Aren't you worried about the real-world ripple effects of these policies, or are you just playing to populist sentiment?" The question was designed to corner him, to force him into either admitting economic ignorance or revealing cynical political calculation. The studio held its breath, waiting for the stumble that would confirm their preconceptions about aging action stars venturing into policy discussions they couldn't possibly understand. Seagal tilted his head slightly, a movement so subtle it might have been missed if not for the years of screen presence that made every gesture deliberately meaningful. A faint smile played at the corners of his mouth, the kind of expression that had preceded devastating combat sequences in dozens of films. When he spoke, his voice carried the patient tone of a master addressing an overeager student. "Joy," he replied, his gravelly whisper somehow filling the entire studio, "in my 30-plus years making movies, I've learned something about real-world consequences. When studios chase the cheapest deal, shipping post-production to countries where skilled labor costs pennies on the dollar, they're not just saving money. They're dismantling the very foundation that built this industry." He paused, his dark eyes scanning the audience with the intensity of a predator evaluating terrain. "I've worked with the same stunt coordinators, the same cinematographers, the same editing teams for decades. These aren't just employees, they're craftsmen who've perfected their art through years of dedication. When we abandon them for cheaper alternatives, we're not just losing jobs. We're losing institutional knowledge, artistic integrity, and the soul of American filmmaking." The response hit the audience like a perfectly executed martial arts technique, unexpected, powerful, and impossible to counter. Applause erupted through the studio, no longer polite but genuinely enthusiastic. Several audience members rose to their feet, their reactions genuine and spontaneous. The sound technicians had to adjust their levels as the crowd's energy reached levels typically reserved for standing ovations. In the control room, producers exchanged increasingly nervous glances. The real-time social media feeds were exploding with clips of Seagal's responses, hashtags like #SeagalWisdom and #HollywoodTruth trending upward at an alarming rate. This wasn't the narrative they'd crafted. The aging action star was supposed to be out of his depth, not delivering quotable philosophy that resonated with viewers across demographic lines. Sunny Hostin, recognizing the shift in momentum, leaned forward with the precision of a prosecutor closing in on a key witness. Her voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to dismantling arguments with surgical precision. "Steven, you talk about protecting American workers and preserving artistic integrity. But many people see your recent statements as divisive rhetoric from someone whose best days in Hollywood are behind him. How do you respond to critics who say you're simply trying to stay relevant by appealing to nationalist sentiment?" The attack was personal, designed to strike at the heart of every aging performer's deepest fear, irrelevance. The camera zoomed in tighter, hunting for the wounded expression that would confirm the narrative of a desperate has-been grasping for attention. The studio fell silent, waiting for either defensive anger or deflated resignation. Instead, Seagal's expression remained serene, almost meditative. He straightened slightly in his chair, his movements carrying the fluid grace that had made him a martial arts icon. When he spoke, his voice carried a new depth, like an actor finding his character's emotional core. "Sonny," he said, his tone softening but carrying an unmistakable steel core, "I've been called many things in my career, some deserved, some not. But irrelevant?" He shook his head slowly, his beard catching the studio lights. "I'm not here to chase relevance. I'm here because I've seen what happens when an industry loses its way, when profit margins matter more than the people who create the magic we all love." He leaned forward slightly, his intensity palpable. "In Aikido, we learn that true strength comes not from attacking but from standing firm in your principles. I've watched this town change, seen talented people pushed aside for cheaper alternatives, witnessed the slow erosion of the craftsmanship that made Hollywood the envy of the world. If speaking up for those people makes me divisive, then I'll wear that label with pride." The audience erupted again, but this time the applause carried a different quality, not just approval, but genuine respect. The energy in the room had shifted decisively. What had begun as an ambush interview was transforming into something unprecedented, a daytime television moment that was actually changing minds in real time. The hosts exchanged quick glances, their carefully planned questions suddenly seeming inadequate against an opponent who refused to play by the expected rules. Whoopi, ever the professional, signaled for a commercial break, her expression mixing frustration with grudging admiration. As the show returned from commercial break, the tension in the studio had transformed into something electric. The hosts had clearly used the intermission to regroup, their expressions showing the kind of focused determination usually reserved for major political interviews. The audience, now fully engaged, leaned forward in anticipation. Social media feeds were exploding with clips from the first segment, and the show's producers were fielding calls from news outlets wanting to know if they were witnessing a genuine cultural moment unfold in real time. Joy Behar, her armor of sarcasm fully deployed, took the lead with renewed aggression. Welcome back to The View. We're here with Steven Seagal, who's been sharing his thoughts on Hollywood policy. Her tone made it clear she considered those thoughts barely worth acknowledgement. Steven, you've positioned yourself as a defender of free speech, especially when it comes to the entertainment industry. But don't you think that freedom gets dangerous when it's used to spread harmful ideas or promote division? The question was a landmine, designed to force Seagal into either defending controversial speech or abandoning his stated principles. The cameras captured every micro-expression, waiting for the moment when the aging action star would finally stumble into the trap they'd so carefully laid. Seagal's response came with the timing of a master martial artist. His fingers drummed lightly on the armrest of his chair, a rhythmic pattern that suggested deep consideration rather than nervousness. When he spoke, his voice carried the patient wisdom of someone who'd spent years studying philosophy alongside physical combat. "Joy," he said, his gravelly tone somehow both gentle and immovable, "in my study of Eastern philosophy, I've learned that truth isn't something you can protect by silencing opposition. It's something you discover through the honest exchange of ideas, even uncomfortable ones. Free speech isn't dangerous, silence is dangerous. When we start deciding who gets to speak and who doesn't, we're not preventing harm. We're preventing growth." The response drew immediate applause, but Seagal wasn't finished. His dark eyes found Joy's with laser focus. "You know what's really harmful? When people stop listening to each other, when we retreat into our separate corners and throw stones instead of building bridges." Sonny Hostin, sensing an opening, jumped in with prosecutorial precision. "But Steven, when that speech leads to real-world harm, to people getting hurt, don't we have a moral responsibility to set boundaries? Isn't unlimited free speech just another form of privilege?" Seagal's response surprised everyone in the studio. Instead of the philosophical weight they'd come to expect, his face broke into a genuine grin, the kind of expression that had charmed audiences through decades of action films. The smile transformed his weathered features, revealing the charismatic performer beneath the serious philosopher. "Sonny," he said, his voice carrying a note of amused warmth, "if we shut down every conversation that might hurt someone's feelings, we'd all be sitting here in complete silence. And I have to say, that would make for pretty terrible television." The audience erupted in laughter, a warm, genuine sound that filled every corner of the studio. The response was so unexpected, so perfectly timed, that even Whoopi couldn't suppress a chuckle. Joy's carefully constructed argument had been deflated not with aggression but with disarming humor. The moment went viral instantly, with viewers posting clips of Seagal's perfectly delivered punchline. But as the laughter subsided, Seagal's expression grew serious again, his transition seamless and powerful. "Here's what I've learned in my years in this business," he said, his voice carrying new gravitas. "We don't build understanding by shouting at each other across a divide. We build it by sitting down together, listening to perspectives that challenge us, and finding the common ground that connects us all." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the panel of hosts. "In martial arts, we call it mushin, no mind, no preconception. You can't truly hear someone if you've already decided what they're going to say. And you can't find truth if you're too afraid to let it challenge what you think you know." The studio exploded in applause, louder and more sustained than anything they'd heard so far. The sound was overwhelming, drowning out the show's music and forcing the sound engineers to frantically adjust their levels. On social media, the Mushin moment was already being shared thousands of times, with viewers expressing amazement at the depth coming from someone they dismissed as a simple action star. The applause seemed to energize rather than satisfy the audience, creating an atmosphere of anticipation that crackled through the studio like electricity before a storm. The hosts, despite their professional composure, were visibly struggling to maintain control of an interview that had completely escaped their carefully crafted script. The real-time social media feed streaming across monitors in the control room showed engagement numbers that were breaking records for daytime television. Whoopi Goldberg, drawing on decades of experience navigating difficult conversations, attempted to steer the discussion back to familiar territory. Her voice carried the authority of someone who'd moderated everything from celebrity feuds to political debates, but there was something different in her tone now, a note of genuine curiosity that hadn't been there at the show's opening. "Okay, Steven," she said, leaning forward with renewed focus, "let's talk about Hollywood specifically. You've been critical of the industry's shift toward global markets, saying it prioritizes international appeal over American values. But the industry is still creating jobs, still generating revenue, still employing thousands of people. In a globalized economy, isn't adaptation just good business sense?" The question was more nuanced than the earlier attacks, suggesting that Seagal's previous responses had earned him a different level of respect. The audience sensed the shift, their attention focused with the intensity usually reserved for championship fights or award show speeches. Seagal nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone who'd witnessed an industry's transformation from the inside. "Whoopi, you're right that Hollywood's still making money. But there's a difference between success and soul, between profit and purpose. When I started making films, every department was filled with craftsmen who'd learned their trade from masters, who took pride in their work, who saw movie making as an art form, not just a business transaction." He paused, his dark eyes reflecting something that might have been sadness. "I've watched studios ship entire post-production departments overseas, not because the work is better, but because it's cheaper. I've seen legendary sound engineers replaced by computer programs, master cinematographers sidelined for directors who prioritize speed over artistry. We're not just losing jobs, we're losing the institutional knowledge that made Hollywood the global standard for entertainment excellence." The response struck a chord that resonated beyond the studio. In the audience, several people nodded with recognition, their expressions suggesting personal connections to the issues he'd raised. The applause that followed was different from the earlier reactions, more thoughtful, more profound, carrying the weight of shared understanding rather than mere appreciation. Joy Behar, her voice carrying a new edge of frustration, jumped back into the fray. "But Steven, isn't this just nostalgia masquerading as policy? The world changes, industries evolve, and workers adapt. Why should Hollywood be exempt from the economic realities that affect every other business in America?" The question was sharp, designed to expose what she clearly believed was the fundamental weakness in his argument. The cameras zoomed in, capturing every nuance of expression as they waited for his response. Seagal's reply came with the precision of a martial arts master executing a perfect technique. "Joy, there's a difference between evolution and erosion. When we embrace change that makes us stronger, that's evolution. When we sacrifice our core values for short-term profit, that's erosion. The question isn't whether Hollywood should adapt to global markets, it's whether we can do that without losing what makes American storytelling unique." He leaned forward, his intensity building. "In Aikido, we learn to use an opponent's force against them, to find strength through flexibility. But we never abandon our center, our core principles. Hollywood has become so flexible that it's lost its center, so eager to please global audiences that it's forgotten how to tell authentically American stories." The studio erupted again, but this time the applause carried a different quality, not just agreement, but genuine inspiration. Several audience members were on their feet, their reactions spontaneous and heartfelt. The energy was building towards something unprecedented in daytime television history. Sunny Hostin made one final attempt to regain control. "Steven, that's a beautiful philosophy, but let's talk specifics. What exactly would you do differently? How would you implement these changes without destroying the industry's competitiveness?" Seagal's response would become the most quoted moment of the entire interview. His voice dropped to that familiar whisper, but somehow it seemed to fill the entire studio. "Sunny, in martial arts, the most powerful techniques are often the simplest ones. You don't need to destroy something to transform it, you need to redirect its energy toward a higher purpose. His weathered hands moved as he spoke, illustrating his points with the fluid gestures of someone accustomed to teaching through demonstration. First, we create incentive structures that reward keeping production domestic. Tax credits for films that employ American crews for the entire production cycle. Grants for training programs that pass skills from master craftsmen to the next generation. Second, we establish quality standards that can't be outsourced, certification programs that ensure every American film meets certain technical and artistic benchmarks. The audience was completely silent now, hanging on every word. Even the hosts seemed genuinely engaged, their prepared antagonism replaced by something approaching professional curiosity. But most importantly, Seagal continued, his voice building with conviction, we remember why people fall in love with movies in the first place. It's not the explosions or the special effects, it's the human connection, the authentic emotion that comes when skilled artists work together to tell stories that matter. You can't outsource that. You can't automate it. You can only nurture it, protect it, and pass it on. The studio exploded in the longest, most sustained applause of the entire interview. The standing ovation lasted nearly 30 seconds, with audience members whistling and cheering with the enthusiasm usually reserved for rock concerts. Social media feeds were going absolutely insane, with clips of the response being shared faster than the platform algorithms could track. As the applause finally died down, there was a palpable shift in the studio's atmosphere. What had begun as an adversarial interview had transformed into something approaching a masterclass, with an aging action star delivering insights that were reshaping how viewers thought about American entertainment. The hosts, despite their initial intentions, found themselves genuinely engaged with arguments they hadn't expected to take seriously. Whoopi, her professional demeanor now mixed with obvious respect, leaned back in her chair. Steven, I have to admit, you've given us a lot to think about. But let me ask you this, you've been in Hollywood for over 3 decades. You've seen these changes happen gradually. What was the moment when you realized the industry had lost its way? The question was personal, inviting vulnerability rather than demanding defensiveness. The cameras captured Seagal's expression as it shifted from philosophical teacher to something more human, more accessible. You know, Whoopi, he said, his voice carrying a note of genuine reflection, it wasn't one moment, it was 1,000 small compromises that added up to something I didn't recognize anymore. I remember working on a film about 10 years ago, and halfway through production, the studio decided to move post-production to Eastern Europe to save money. These were sound engineers and editors I'd worked with for 15 years, people who knew my voice, understood my vision. His expression darkened slightly. I watched master craftsmen, people who'd worked on everything from The Godfather to Star Wars. I watched them train their own replacements via video calls, teaching strangers overseas the techniques they'd spent decades perfecting. And for what? To save a few percentage points on the budget so executives could hit their quarterly numbers. The studio had grown unusually quiet, the audience sensing they were witnessing something rare in entertainment, genuine, unfiltered honesty from someone with nothing left to lose and everything to gain by telling the truth. Joy Behar, her earlier antagonism replaced by journalistic curiosity, pressed deeper. But Steven, didn't you have the power to push back? You were the star, presumably you had some influence over those decisions. Seagal's laugh was rueful, carrying decades of industry battles. Joy, that's where people misunderstand how Hollywood really works. Stars have influence over their performances, their image, maybe the final cut if they're lucky. But the financial decisions? Those happen in boardrooms in New York, made by people who see movies as widgets, not art. By the time you find out what's happening, the contracts are signed and the damage is done. He shifted forward, his intensity building again. I started speaking up about these issues because I realized that if people like me, who've benefited from the system, who have platforms and resources, if we don't speak up, then who will? The struggling sound engineer in Burbank doesn't have access to talk shows. The lighting technician who's been replaced by cheaper overseas labor can't get on Twitter and reach millions of people. Sunny Hostin, her prosecutorial instincts now channeled toward understanding rather than attack, asked, so you see yourself as speaking for people who don't have a voice. Not speaking for them, Seagal corrected, his tone firm but not dismissive. Speaking with them. There's a difference. I've spent the last 5 years visiting film schools, talking to young people who want to work in this industry, listening to veterans who've been pushed aside. I'm not presuming to know their experiences, I'm amplifying their voices, using whatever platform I have to make sure their stories get heard. The response drew another wave of applause, but Seagal wasn't finished. His voice took on an edge of passion that had been building throughout the interview. Here's what really gets me, he said, his gravelly whisper somehow carrying to every corner of the studio. Hollywood loves to talk about diversity, about inclusion, about giving opportunities to underrepresented groups. And those are important conversations. But how can we talk about creating opportunities when we're systematically eliminating the jobs that provide those opportunities? How can we claim to support American workers when we're shipping their livelihoods overseas? The question hung in the air like a challenge, forcing everyone present to confront contradictions they might not have previously considered. The audience's response was immediate and overwhelming, not just applause, but genuine appreciation for someone willing to speak uncomfortable truths about an industry that rarely examined its own contradictions. As the interview entered its final segment, the atmosphere in the studio had become electric with anticipation. What had begun as a routine ambush interview had transformed into something unprecedented, a moment of genuine discourse that was changing minds in real time. The social media feed streaming across control room monitors showed engagement numbers that were breaking records, with clips of Seagal's responses being shared across demographic and political lines that rarely agreed on anything. Sunny Hostin, recognizing that this might be their last chance to challenge the narrative that had emerged, leaned forward with the intensity of a prosecutor delivering a closing argument. Her voice carried the weight of someone who'd spent years dismantling carefully constructed defenses, and her question was designed to cut through everything that had come before. "Steven, let's get completely honest here," she said, her tone sharp but not disrespectful. "Many people watching this show see you as a Hollywood has-been, someone whose career peaked decades ago and who's now trying to stay relevant by appealing to populist sentiment. How do we know this isn't just another performance, another role you're playing to get attention in an industry that's moved beyond you?" The attack was surgical, designed to strip away everything Seagal had built during the interview and reduce him to the caricature they'd expected him to be from the beginning. The cameras zoomed in tight, hunting for the crack in his composure that would confirm the narrative of a desperate performer grasping for relevance. But Seagal didn't flinch. Instead, something unexpected happened, his expression softened, becoming more human, more vulnerable than anything they'd seen during the entire hour. When he spoke, his voice carried a different quality, less philosopher and more man confronting his own mortality and legacy. "Sonny," he began, his gravelly whisper somehow more powerful for its gentleness, "you're not wrong about my career. I'm not the box office draw I was in the 90s. I'm not getting offered the big-budget action films anymore. In Hollywood terms, I probably am a has-been." The admission surprised everyone in the studio. This wasn't the defensive response they'd expected, and the audience leaned forward, sensing something profound was about to emerge. "But here's what I've learned in my 60s, Seagal continued, his dark eyes finding Sonny's with unwavering directness. "Relevance isn't about staying famous. It's about using whatever time and platform you have left to say something that matters. Maybe I am trying to stay relevant, but not for my career. For the people whose careers are being destroyed by decisions made in boardrooms by executives who've never set foot on a film set." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the panel of hosts and then to the audience beyond. "In Aikido, we talk about zanshin, the awareness that extends beyond the immediate moment, the responsibility that doesn't end when the technique is complete. I've made my money, I've had my fame. Now it's time for zanshin, using what I've learned to protect what comes next." The studio erupted in applause, but Seagal raised a gentle hand, indicating he wasn't finished. The crowd quieted immediately, hanging on his every word. "Whoopi asked me earlier about accountability," he said, his voice building towards something that felt like a summation. "Here's my accountability, I benefited from a system that nurtured craftsmanship, that invested in American workers, that believed art mattered as much as profit. If I stay silent while that system is dismantled, then I'm complicit in its destruction." His final words came with the weight of absolute conviction. "I'd rather be called a has-been who spoke up than a legend who stayed silent while an industry lost its soul." The standing ovation that followed lasted over a minute, with audience members cheering, whistling, and applauding with an intensity that forced the show's producers to extend the segment. Social media exploded with reactions ranging from shock to admiration, with #SeagalTruth trending worldwide within minutes. In the days following the interview, something remarkable happened. Film schools across the country reported increased enrollment in traditional production courses. Veteran Hollywood craftsmen found themselves flooded with requests from young filmmakers eager to learn time-honored techniques. Industry trade publications published deep-dive analyses of American film production's migration overseas, sparking congressional hearings on entertainment industry job protection. Seagal had inadvertently launched a movement. As Whoopi delivered her closing remarks, her voice reflected the day's unexpected journey. "Steven Seagal, everybody," proving that sometimes the most profound insights come from the most surprising sources. This conversation has clearly struck a nerve, and we want to keep it going. Comment below with respect for all perspectives. Whether you agree with Steven's views or not, let's discuss this like adults. Share this interview if it made you think differently about Hollywood or American workers. And don't forget to subscribe, because conversations like this are exactly why we do this show. Sometimes the voices we need to hear most are the ones we least expect to listen to. What's your take on Hollywood's responsibility to American workers?